So in 4.6, we're kind of continuing on what we've been doing by solving equations with factoring, but this is a different type of factoring that we have here with completing the square. We're going to skip this slide, and so we're looking at slide number 3. Solve the equation 2x squared is equal to 72 by finding square roots. So whenever we have a x squared without any other x's in our equation, how we want to solve this is get this squared term to be all by itself. So if that 2 is being multiplied to x squared, how can we get rid of the 2? Awesome. Divide both sides by 2. So now we have x squared is equal to, what's 72 divided by 2? 36. And then how do you think we can get rid of that squared on the x?
By figuring out what 36 is, like, squared.
So we take the square root of both sides. So the square root and the squared cancel each other out. So then we're left with x is equal to, what's the square root of 36? 6. But when we take the square root of both sides of our equation, so we square root and square root, we always have to remember plus or minus 6. So that plus or minus means that x is equal to a positive 6 and x is equal to a negative 6. So these are both of our answers for this. But we could write it like this all together, or you could write it like this, either way. So we have a positive 2 and a negative 2. So in this equation, we could plug in a positive 6 or a negative 6. We could plug in a positive 6 and it would work for x. We could plug in a negative 6 and it would work for x. So we have 2 answers here, positive and negative 6. Any questions on this one? Again, so anytime you take the square root of both sides of your equation, you have to include that plus or minus in your answer. So let's look at our next example. So what do you think we have to do first here? So this looks a little bit like the last one. Same thing. What should we do first? Awesome. We want to get that x squared all by itself. So we divide both sides by 6. So that 6 cancels. So we have x squared is equal to, what's 54 divided by 6? Nine? 9. So x squared is equal to 9. How do we get that x all by itself? We need to get rid of that squared. Square root both sides, so this cancels. So x is equal to, what's the square root of 9? What's that one thing we can't forget? Plus or minus 3. So anytime you take the square root of both sides, you need that plus or minus 3. Any questions on this one? Alright, so next thing we're going to do today is called completing the square. Sometimes when we have a quadratic equation, so like what we've been dealing with where we have an x squared, an x, and a number, we're not always going to have 2 factors of this number that add to the middle one so we can solve it that way. Sometimes we have to add into our equation this b over 2 squared. And that b comes from your middle number here. So if we had x squared plus 4x, let's just say x squared plus 4x, what would we have to add in here to complete the square? What's our b? Our b. So our b is just this middle number here. So it would be 4 over 2. What's 4 over 2 simplified? 2. 2. So this would be 2 squared that we're adding in there, which would be 4. So we just take this middle number, put it over 2 and square it, and that's what we have to add in here to complete the square. So all the problems that we're doing on the next 9 slides have to deal with this equation here. Alright, the next question asks what value completes the square for x squared minus 10x? So the first few questions on your homework are going to ask you what value completes the square. So we just need to find what can we put in this blank here to complete the square. So our little formula that we have is b over 2 squared. So what's our b here? Negative 10. So we have negative 10 over 2 squared. What is negative 10 over 2? How can we simplify? Negative 5 squared. And what's negative 5 squared? Awesome. Negative 5 times negative 5 is positive 25. So 25 completes the square there. So on the homework, it'll have like x squared minus 10x and then a blank. You would put 25 into that blank because 25 completes the square. Alright, so now we are completing the square. So we have to plug in a number here and actually complete the square. So we use that little formula we have. That is b over 2 squared. So what's our b?
4.
Just 4? Negative 4. So the sign stays with it. So it's negative 4 over 2 squared. How can we simplify negative 4 over 2? Awesome. Negative 2 squared. And what's negative 2 squared? 4. So a 4 goes into the blank here. That's what we're adding. But to complete the square, we have our parentheses squared. And what goes in it is this x and this number that's squared. So the two things here that have that little squared on top of it, so this x is squared, this negative 2 is squared, these two things come inside our parentheses. So we have x and then minus 2 squared. So x minus 2 squared would be our answer. So we plug in before we square it. Alright. Again, we're completing the square. So our little formula is b over 2 squared. What's our b? So 10 over 2 squared. How can we simplify 10 over 2? 5. So in here we would have 5 squared. And what's 5 squared? 25. But in our parentheses, we care about the x squared and the 5 squared. So we would just put in our x and put in our 5. So it would be x plus 5 squared. Okay, last one like this. Our little formula that we have is b over 2 squared. What's our b? So we have 2 over 2 squared. What does 2 over 2 simplify to? 1. So we have 1 squared. And what's 1 squared? 1. But what's going to go into our parentheses here?
X plus 1 squared.
Awesome. X plus 1 squared. Okay, so now we're actually going to be solving equations by completing the square. So a couple important things. First thing we need to do is put it in this order. We need the x squared and the x term all by itself on the left side, and then the number on the right side. So the only thing that's going to be on the left side of our equation are the x terms. And then once we have the x terms on one side, we have to add in our b over 2 squared to each side of the equation. So we're adding it to both sides. So each side of the equation gets this b over 2 squared added to it. All right, so first thing we need to do is get this x squared plus 4x all by itself. So how do we move that plus 4 to the other side of our equation? Subtract 4. So we have x squared plus 4x is equal to, what's 25 minus 4? 21. Now in here is going to go the number that we need to complete the square. So we put our formula b over 2 squared. So what's our b here? 4. So we have 4 over 2 squared. How can we simplify 4 over 2? 2 squared. And what's 2 squared? 4. So we're adding 4 on the left side of our equation, so we have to add 4 on the right side too. Because what we do on one side, we have to do on the other. We have to keep our equation balanced. So that's why I circled on the last page, what you do, you have to add it to each side. You add it to both. Now I'm going to simplify my left side just like I did in all those other examples. I put it into my parentheses squared. So what goes into the parentheses here? X plus 2 squared. So you got to remember the x and then plus 2. So the two things that are squared here, so you have that squared and squared, go into our parentheses squared. And then this is going to be equal to, what's 25 plus 4? I mean 21 plus 4, I'm sorry, 25. So we have x plus 2 squared is equal to 25. Now the same thing we did when we had x squared in our equation, and we needed to get rid of that squared, we took the square root. We're going to do that here too. We take the square root, so this cancels out with the squared. And then what we do on one side, we have to do the other. So we take the square root of both sides. So it cancels out on the left. We're left with x plus 2. And then what's that one thing we can't forget when we take the square root of both sides? The plus or minus. So what's the square root of 25? Plus or minus 5. Now from here we want to solve our equation for x. So we want to split this up into x plus 2 is equal to positive 5 and x plus 2 is equal to negative 5. So I'm just going to split it up into two equations. Yes. X plus 2 is equal to positive 5. X plus 2 is equal to negative 5. And now we solve for x. So how do I solve for x in my left equation over here? How do I get that x all by itself? And this one, I want to move that 2 to the other side. So I subtract 2. So x is equal to, what's 5 minus 2? 3. And then I do the same thing on the right side. I have to subtract 2. So what's negative 5 minus 2? Negative 7. So x is equal to 3 and x is equal to negative 7. So there's a lot of steps here, but nothing too wild going on. Just got to be careful with all the steps we have. All right, let's look at number 12. This question just asks, how can we rewrite the equation so the left side is in the form x plus a squared. So we just want it to look like this. We don't have to solve it all the way. We're just trying to get to our parentheses. So this one's not too bad. We don't have to go all the way. So what's the first thing we should do with our equation here? Remember, we want to get the x's all by itself on one side of the equation. So how do we move that 5? Subtract 5. So we subtract 5 on both sides. So we have x squared plus 12x is equal to, what is 3 minus 5? -2. Now I need to put something in here to help me complete the square so I can get it into my parentheses. So my little formula is b over 2 squared. So what's my b here? 12. So I have 12 over 2 squared. What's 12 over 2 simplify to? 6. So I have 6 squared. And then what's 6 squared? 6 times 6. 36. So if I add 36 on the left side, I have to add 36 on the right side too. Now in my parentheses squared, I just take the two things on my left side of the equation that have that little squared symbol. So what are they going to be? Awesome. X plus 6. And then on the right side, I just need to simplify this. I have -2 plus 36. So what does that give me? 34. And this question asks us just to leave it in our parentheses step. So this is our answer. So for this one, we don't have to solve it all the way. We just want to leave it in our step with the parentheses. This is as far as we go here. All right, 2 more. What's the first thing we need to do here? Remember, we want to get this all by itself. So how do we move that 9? Awesome. Subtract 9 on both sides. So we have x squared plus 6x is equal to, what is 1 minus 9? -8. So now we want to put something in here that completes the square. So we use our little formula, b over 2 squared. So what's our b? Six. So 6 over 2 squared. How can we simplify 6 over 2? Or just 3. So we have 3 squared. And what's 3 squared? 9. So if we add 9 to the left side, we have to add 9 to the right side too. Now we can draw our parentheses. What's going to go inside of our parentheses? So the two things that are squared, we have that x, and then what else is squared? 3. So x plus 3, and then that's going to be equal to, what is -8 plus 9? One. Now how can we get rid of this parentheses squared? What do we need to do to get rid of that? We have to take the square root of both sides of our equation, so this cancels. So then we're just left with x plus 3. And what is the square root of 1? 1. But what's the one thing we can't forget when we take the square root of both sides of our equation? Plus or minus. So this is plus or minus 1. Now we have to split it up because x plus 3 is equal to positive 1 and x plus 3 is equal to negative 1. So x plus 3 is equal to 1 and x plus 3 is equal to negative 1. Now we just solve for x. So in our left equation, how do we solve for x? How can we get that x all by itself when you move the 3? How can we move 3?
Subtract 3.
Awesome. Subtract 3 on both sides. So x is equal to, what is 1 minus 3? Negative 2. And then we do the same thing in our second equation. Subtract 3. What's negative 1 minus 3? Negative 4. So these are our two equations here. If you just want to take a screenshot of it so you have it. How do we get that x squared plus 4x all by itself? Awesome. Subtract 2. So we have x squared plus 4x is equal to, what's 0 minus 2? Negative 2. So now we need to put that number that completes the square for us in the blank. Our little formula is b over 2 squared. So what's our b? 4. So we have 4 over 2 squared. What's 4 over 2 simplified to? 2 squared. And what's 2 squared? 4. So if we add 4 on the left side, we have to add 4 on the right side also. So now, in our parentheses, what do we put?
X plus 2.
Awesome. X plus 2 squared. And then that's going to be equal to, what is negative 2 plus 4? 2. Now, how do we get rid of this parentheses squared here? What do we have to do to both sides of our equation to get rid of that?
We need to find the square root.
Take the square root of both sides. So the square root cancels out with that squared. So we have x plus 2 on the left side. What's the one thing we can't forget when we take the square root of both sides? Plus or minus. So plus or minus square root 2. Can we simplify the square root of 2? Nope. Just the square root of 2. It's not a perfect square, so it doesn't become a whole number. And typically here we would split this up, but since we can't simplify this square root 2, we just subtract 2 on both sides. So we get x is equal to plus or minus square root 2 minus 2. Can we combine square root of 2 and 2?
No.
No. You can't combine the square root with a whole number when you're adding or subtracting. So we can't combine these together, so we just leave it like this. This is our most simplified we can go. This is our final answer. So that's why we don't have to split it up into 2, because we can't combine it with that negative 2 anyways.